welcome to every story. We're going to be reading a story, but first we're going to be reading Bible, and then you're going to this, and then you're going to be reading the Hittite Warrior. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell and notice the video.
Go, Boba. Yeah, it's not the Hittite Warrior. It's actually just Hittite Warrior. So, alright, but now we're going to be reading Ecclesiastes. Actually, no, it's just Ecclesiastes. Chapter 2. This is the English Standard Version. And I'm not sure where JJ just went. And now he's back. Oh, he brought the child, the Baby Yoda, and Foxy with him. Alright, so here we go. This is Chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, the English Standard Version. Let me begin. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity, for of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all who have been long forgotten, all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given him wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. That is the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I hope you're enjoying the reading of God's Word and that He is blessing you in it. So, in our reading of Hittite Warrior, so Uriah the Hittite, and he has his horse, Larbanish, and he and his horse go around the world of Hittitatia, whatever it's called, actually Hatti. So they are Zawa, and everybody lives, and they're all just so peachy keen and happy.
So much food.
And Uriah gets to keep his horse too. And here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
So what actually happened was Uriah had to give up Labarnish, which means great one, I think, something like that. And he was really sad, and he took him over to the capital city, and it said that he never saw the capital again. But on his way out, they heard a man. They saw a man getting arrested for, I forget who he was saying was coming, but like basically bad guys were coming, and then
It's the Achaeans.
yeah, the Achaeans. So they went over and they heard somebody calling for help, or there was smoke, I forget which. And so they go over and see that this village was completely burned to the ground. And after helping the survivors, I think there was only one or two.
There was one that was completely harmed.
Yeah. After helping the survivors, they literally rushed back over to their house in their village, only to find it was also burned. And his family was either, I think they found his family's bodies. So at least they weren't taken prisoner, though, because that would probably be a bit worse. But so then they live over there for a bit, eating from their orchards and their fields. And then this one guy comes over and he's like, "Give me all your harvest." And his dad was like, "No." And then he got beat to death.
Just say no.
Almost to death, and then he died later from injuries. And he told, I'm sorry, I forgot the name again. Uriah. He told Uriah to go over to this one place. I think it's in Egyptian territory, right?
We'll talk about it. Yep.
So he's going over there. He finds this caravan, and there's a bunch of big fancy people on these that's like on a tray held up by 4 people. I forget what they're called. There's some special fancy word for it. And then somebody attacks in the night and tries to kill him, and then there's he kills the guy, but then the rest of them heard the guy's screams, and they came over and attacked, and he saved one of the super fancy people. And okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay, wait. This is important.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so then the next day, the guy is like, "Hey, thanks for saving my life. Do you have any food? Where are you going?" So he had just run out of food that morning, and it turns out that the place where he's going is actually pretty not safe. So he's going with that guy for a little while to at least regroup, and I think that's about it now.
Okay.
Around the same age, I think. Yeah, the same age. He was actually on his first...
I think he's about 16.
Yes. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read us a story.
All right, so the Achaeans, in case you don't realize, is the Greeks. You would know that if you read Homer. Maybe we'll read Homer one day, but we would know that if we read Homer. The Iliad is the story of the Trojan War, in which the Achaeans band together and attack Troy. And actually, Troy was even mentioned in that chapter, one of those two chapters. So, all right, so this is chapter 3, the house of Ethbaal. And JJ wanted to say the first word is the. All right, let me go ahead and begin. The caravan followed the great king's highway into Canaan by way of Damascus, into a land of many hills and valleys and rocks, swift streams and awesome forests, and a great snow-capped range of mountains towering over all. Many people seemed to live there, for the road was crowded at times, especially as we moved farther south. There were fields and villages and towns all along the way. Having stopped for some light trading at the bustling town of Damascus, we turned westward toward the sea. The land was smoother there, and it was not long before we passed the high, gleaming wall of Canaan's great city of Sidon, and for the first time in my life I smelled salt in the air and heard in the distance the sound of surf rolling in on the shore, and then, soon after, we came to Tyre. The town of Tyre was on an island approached by a narrow causeway from the beach. To come to the causeway, we had to pass through a tangle of miserable hovels of brick and mud, huddled about the shore. Never before, even in the worst villages at home, had I seen such dirt and smelled such smells. The huts were so crowded together that I wondered that people who lived in them had room to breathe, much less move. But then we came out upon the causeway, and all the great sea was around us, and before us the golden towered wall of the city with its well-guarded gate. Soldiers watched us as we passed through. They seemed to be of two different kinds, and one kind I had never seen before. They were slim, very dark, and clean-shaven, and wore nothing, it seemed, but brightly patterned kilts belted about their waists. "What sort of man is that?" I asked the donkey boy. "They are Egyptian soldiers from the garrison," said the boy indifferently. "They help our temple guards keep order and see that the city pays its taxes to Egypt." I made a sign against evil. This was the first Egyptian soldier I had ever seen. Never had I seen so many people crowded together as within the walls of Tyre. People thronged about the outdoor shops set up in the streets of the bakers, jewelers, vegetable sellers, and the rest. Street musicians hung about, playing their instruments and looking for silver. Some of the streets were little more than alleys, and it was hard to push your way through them. There were few horses and chariots about, but many donkeys and sedan chairs and simple carts. In the middle of all this, we came upon an open place in which was a building surrounded by a courtyard. "Is this the temple of Melkarth?" I asked the donkey boy, for Melkarth was the Baal, or patron god, of Tyre. The donkey boy shook his head and, to my surprise, shuddered a little. "No," he said, "this is the temple of Moloch." And he shuddered again with a cringing reverence in the direction of the building. He said no more about it. A strange cold feeling had come over me as I looked at it, and I did not know why, for the building itself was not ugly. Ethbaal had told the donkey boy to guide me to his father's house. He had given me a letter for his father, written on a tablet of clay to explain my arrival, for he himself had first to go to his father's warehouse. I looked with scorn at the marks on the tablet. The house of Ethbaal was made of brick and wood and was 3 stories high, with a beautifully columned door. A servant took my letter, leaving me to stand in amazement in the entryway, gazing upon the splendor of bright tiles and ornaments and beautiful rugs, though the furnishings were few and simple. This was surely a great house of the city. The servant returned with a message of welcome, and, as I was hot and dirty, I was shown to a room at the top of the house in which was a shallow tub, and another servant to pour hot water upon me. This gave me great pleasure, and the scrubbing I gave myself with soda powder set my blood to racing, so that when it was time for the evening meal, I found that I was ready to face these strangers unafraid. Ethbaal himself met me when I came into the common room from washing myself. He was a small, elderly man, very thin and seeming never to be at rest. His hair was gray, and he had a stringy beard, too thin to be held in a net, as were the beards of many of the Canaanite men. But his eyes were sharp and kind, and he was resolved to make me welcome for his son's sake. "The young Hittite," he said, "there are many of you about now, fine young men with fair skins and good, strong noses. You will make your way in Canaan, all of you. I must embrace you, for now you are as a son of the family." And he did so. Then he led me to where the others waited. "My mother," he said with great respect, "the Lady Maris, whose youngest and only living son I am. She is the woman of the house, for my wives are dead." I bowed to the Lady Maris, who was very old and wrinkled and dressed with great richness, a mantle covering her white hair and heavy gold ornaments hiding her fingers and hanging from her ears. She leaned on the arm of a young girl who also wore gold rings and earrings and a golden headband. She was called Ethbaal and was the old lady's granddaughter, the youngest child of Ethbaal. A young man stood behind her in the shadows, watching me angrily with large dark eyes. I thought at first that he was another of Ethbaal's sons, but Ethbaal called him his kinsman, and I saw that his eyes were just as angry when he looked at the others. He did not speak to me. His name was Jotham, and Ethbaal said that he came from the south of Canaan, somewhere near Jerusalem, the town of the Jebusites. "My son is kept late at the warehouse," said Ethbaal, "but you are hungry, and we will not wait for him." We seated ourselves on small Egyptian rugs about a low table, and Ethbaal invoked the blessings of Adonai the Lord, and El the Almighty, all the Baals in general, and Baal Melkarth, patron of Tyre, in particular upon our meal. It was a fine meal, with roast pigeon, artichokes, and strange tempting cakes. There was wine, too, though the mother of Ethbaal drank beer instead. Ethbaal explained to me that this was because she had come from Egypt, where beer was the favorite drink. So the mother of Ethbaal, too, was an Egyptian. I looked at her with uneasy eyes. Ethbaal leaned toward me and spoke in a low voice. "The family of my mother once lived in Akataten. They pick the worst words to cross over the lines. Akhenaten, the accursed city. Her father's father was brought up as a child near the court of the criminal Pharaoh, and her grandmother could remember his brother, the young Tutankhamun. I did not know what he was talking about. I knew nothing of any Egyptians except that wicked Ramesses who had fought us at Kadesh, and the very thought of that great and hated land was a dark and awesome mystery. The mother of Ethbaal had raised her head, and I could see how bright her eyes were among the dark wrinkles of her face. "He was no criminal," she said in her old whispering voice. "He was the true Pharaoh, the true and beautiful child of Adonai. There are no true pharaohs on the throne of Egypt now." There was an embarrassed silence. Then the young girl called Mehetabel spoke briskly. "My grandmother is very old," she said, "and can say what she likes. Her grandmother told her many stories of the accursed city. It is so long ago that most people have forgotten it, and we need not be ashamed." "It smelled of flowers," said the old woman stubbornly. Now Ethbaal found his voice and changed the subject. "Tell me of yourself, my son," he said to me. "Hannah-Baal says in his letter that your father was a man of property in Great Hatti. What did he raise on his land?" "Wheat, Barley, I said. We had many orchards and kept bees, but mostly we raised horses on the grasslands. I swallowed hard, for my throat had tightened with longing for home. Ethbaal was impressed. Chariot horses? He asked eagerly. War horses? The finest, I replied, remembering Labarnish. If that could be done here, cried Ethbaal, raising his hands. But this poor land is mostly for orchards and sheep. Still, we do a good business from the wool. Show him Mehetabel. The girl Mehetabel rose with pride and came for me to touch the cloth of her robe. It was finer and softer than any material I had felt before. From our workshops, said Ethbaal, the finest. You see that it is bordered in the Canaanite purple. Only here can the purple dye be made. She jingles when she walks, said Jotham scornfully, and it was true, for there were silver ornaments at her wrists and ankles. But Mehetabel only smiled at him. It was the first time he had spoken. He seemed a strange young man, but everything in his house was strange to me. I was pleased to hear Hanabaal's voice in the entryway, for he at least was not a stranger. I saw him through the door, giving his walking stick to a servant, and having his hands and feet washed. He greeted me happily after having embraced Ethbaal and bowed to the grandmother, and I could not help being warmed by his sweet smile and gracious manner. Ethbaal was overjoyed to see him, and I could see that he was the pride of his heart. He is all that is left to me, he said. There were 4 other sons, one who might also have been a grandfather himself now, if he had married young, but he was the firstborn. Here he stopped, and an uncomfortable silence fell upon us. I did not understand what the trouble was, but for some reason I felt the same cold feeling that had come upon me once before that day, near the temple of Moloch. But Ethbaal did not say what had become of his firstborn son. 2 others were lost at sea, he continued, and another of plague like my wives. Hanabal is all that is left, but he will bring me honors, I have no doubt. He was silent for a moment. Then, as if shaking off some deep sadness, he turned to me, saying briskly, And you, my son, what are your plans in Canaan? Are you a good man of business? Can you keep accounts? They were all smiling at me in encouragement, and I felt my face grow hot. I cannot read, I said at last. There was a shocked silence, and I began to frown. Bookkeepers, traders, I thought angrily. Who but low-caste priests and servant scribes could read or write? High-born Hittites had better things to do than spend their lives over 1,000 signs and pictures and learn to make marks in clay. But Hanabal was smiling again. Here in Canaan, he said, it is necessary for a man of position to read and write. It is not as it is in Great Hatti, where the sacred picture writing is a mystery in itself. Here we have an easy way, only 22 signs from which all words may be formed. You will learn quickly. I do not care to learn, I said rudely. I am not a scribe. The young man Jotham snorted, but the others were patient with me still, explaining that in the coastal trading cities, a man who could read and write and keep accounts could rise to great wealth and power. There is work you could do for me here in Tyre, said Ethbaal. But I am going to Harosheth, I answered. You cannot go there for a while, said Hanabal. There will be few caravans, for they say there is trouble again in the hills. You will have time to learn many things here. And his face alight, he talked for a long time of the wonders of the business and his father's possessions, farms where sheep were raised, workshops where cloths were woven, ships to carry the produce to the far corners of the world, and a copper smithy. Ethbaal listened to all this, nodding his approval, and I wondered if Hanabal would talk on through the night. At last, however, his father stopped him, saying that it was late, and that prudent men did not waste oil for their lamps, and that it was time for prayers and offerings before bed. And now a thing happened that surprised me more than anything I had yet seen. And at mention of prayers, Jotham rose from his rug and walked from the room. The hair rose on the back of my neck, for, I thought, No man in his right mind would refuse to honor the gods. Though the gods had not protected me, I still feared them. Ethbaal saw my look of horror and said to me, Jotham must be forgiven. He has suffered greatly, and a man whose birthright has been stolen must always be bitter. And he added under his breath, those scoundrels down in Gaza. We said our prayers and made our offerings of incense before the household images and a little gold statue of Astarte, the sacred mother. Then, as the lamps were burning low, we went to bed. I found that I must share a room with Jotham. I decided that, sooner or later, I must speak to him. I did not know what to say, for though he seemed to be a Canaanite lord, there was something different about him. Tyre is a fine city, I said at last, out of politeness. It is a den of evil, replied Jotham. I decided to try again. The people, I said, are very kind to strangers. Jotham laughed. Ask the strangers who make their purple dye how kind they are. But, I said, how is it that you, who are one of them, should speak like that? To my amazement, he gave me such a savage look that I stepped back away from him. I am not one of them, he said. After this he would not speak at all, and after a while he slept, leaving me to listen to the shouts of quarrelsome voices and the rattle of cartwheels outside, and to dream of the silent plains of Arzawa. Chapter 4. The Blue-Eyed Man. Who is Jotham? I said to Hannibal. He was showing me about the city that morning, so that I could see the extent of his father's possessions and how he managed his affairs. We walked, for Hannibal said that he could move faster than his chair carriers, who were very lazy. Jotham is our kinsman, said Hannibal. My father loves him, because his mother was his favorite niece, and was lost to our family many years ago. But he says that he is not one of you. He is not, replied Hannibal. He comes of an evil and blasphemous people. He is a Hebrew. What is a Hebrew? They were men of Canaan long ago. Then, when the desert tribes and shepherd chiefs moved down into Egypt, in a time of trouble, they were among them. They became conquerors and rulers there. The great dynasty of Egypt rose up against them and enslaved all those who were not driven out. Years later, some of their tribes escaped into the desert, returned to Canaan, and took over many of the towns to the south of the Egyptian governors. From the Egyptian governors. They have been driven out of most of them, and, with the help of Egypt, we keep them down as best we can. But they still make trouble for us. Then how is Jotham your kinsman? His mother was my cousin, but she turned her back on her family to marry Jotham's father. Now, in the eyes of these Hebrew tribes, Jotham's father did wrong in taking a wife from the Canaanites, a strange woman, as they would call her. Why is that? Because they worship the desert god Java, who they now say is the same as El, the Almighty, and Adonai, the Lord. They may worship no other but him, for they say that he is jealous of the others. They call themselves Israel, the fighters of God, and Our Lady, the holy Astarte, they say is an abomination, probably Astarte, is an abomination, and so are the Baals of our cities, and so are the beautiful images of our holy ones. He was beginning to get angry, and I reminded him that he had been telling me about Jotham. Jotham's mother, our kinswoman, died when he was a child. His father, Amram, died a few years later. Amram was a prosperous man, as these hill tribes count it. Jotham inherited flocks and herds, and all would have gone well with him if he had not had an uncle in the south, in the town of Gaza, who is a real scoundrel. I waited impatiently while he stopped to buy 2 cakes from a street vendor. Is this uncle a Hebrew? I asked him, for I had assumed that they were all country tribesmen living in the hills. Of course, said Hannibal, but he is a man of wealth and position in Gaza, and I have heard that he honors Astarte and the Baals like everyone else. He is a real scoundrel, though, and he wanted his brother's property, too. So he went to Jotham's tribe and stirred them up against him. He said that Jotham had no right to his father's possessions, and that his mother was a strange woman who had kept an image of Astarte in her tent. So they drove Jotham out, and the uncle got the flocks and the herds. I felt a new sympathy for Jotham, but I wondered, since it was Tyre that had sheltered him when his own people had driven him out, why he had called Tyre a den of evil. "Here is the street of weavers," said Ethbaal, and I saw that we had come to one of his father's enterprises. Ethbaal took me into one of his father's work sheds, a dark place noisy with the rattle of shuttles. A man with a whip walked among the weavers, supervising their work. No voices were heard. The looms were worked by women and children. This surprised me, for at home slaves were seldom given regular work until they were grown. I said so, and Ethbaal was shocked. "We cannot afford such waste," he said. "Should we squander our longshoremen and our stronger women on light work such as this? Labor is expensive, and my father's workers are always well fed to keep up their strength. Where would my family be if we spent our money for no return?" "They don't talk much," I observed. "They are not allowed to talk. How much work would be done if the workers were allowed to gossip? Besides, we want no trouble among them." "All the goods you make here in Tyre," I said. "It must take many slaves. How do you get them?" "We trade for them among the foreigners," said Ethbaal, "and sometimes our merchants go to warring tribes or nations and buy up the prisoners of war at a low price. We can get them cheaply, too, from the slave traders of the desert, but it is the cheapest of all to take them from among the Hebrews in the hills." Ethbaal also showed me his father's copper smithy. It was a smaller shop than the weaving rooms, and was hotter than I could bear because of the furnaces in which the metal was melted. The slave labor stayed by the furnaces, heating and pouring the metal. They seemed very pale. I suppose it was because they worked long hours, stopping only for a few minutes to eat, and for a few hours at night. "Some day," said Ethbaal, "I will take you to the dye houses on the shore where we send our cloth for coloring. Not till you become used to things, though, or the smell will sicken you. The purple dye is made by grinding snails that have the coloring inside them. It is a costly process, for it takes so many of the sea creatures. Then, too, the men who pull the grindstones must be the strongest slaves. That is why they are blinded, so there is no chance of their escaping. They are very expensive, and, as the work is hard, they don't live long. That is why only great men can afford the purple." I found that my morning meal was not resting so easily in my stomach. Jotham was in Ethbaal's big warehouse on the waterfront, and when we reached it, he was counting bolts of cloth and making marks on soft clay tablet with a reed pen. Ethbaal gave him a pleasant greeting and asked if there was any work I could do to show me how things were done. "One who cannot read and write?" said Jotham sourly. "What work can he do?" But he told me to climb the ladder and call off to him the articles that were stacked on the shelves so that he might list them. "At least," he said, "you speak the language." Before it came, I was longing for the midday meal, for if the slaves of Canaan labored unceasingly, so did their masters. I was high on the ladder, shouting down to Jotham of 3 bolts of the thinnest wool, stained with the purple dye, when I heard a jingle as of little bells, and looked down to see Mehetabel smiling up at me. She herself had brought the food, bread, cheese, wine, and figs, and Jotham was angry. "It is not right," he said, "for a woman of good family to walk in the streets alone." "I did not walk," said Mehetabel. "I came in the chair, and I covered my face. Come and walk on the waterfront while you finish your meal." It was the hottest time of the day, but did not seem unpleasant with that strange salt air blowing gently in from the sea. The waterfront and the wharves were made of stone whose heat burned pleasantly through my sandals. The wharves swarmed with longshoremen loading cargoes onto black tub-like ships, urged on by the foremen armed with bronze-tipped spears, who shouted commands in hoarse voices. Down by a dock at the bend of the waterfront, cargo was being unloaded from a galley that had cast anchor. Ethbaal waved toward it proudly, saying that it was her father's, just back from a trip to the islands in the Western Sea. "The shipmaster," she said, looking at Jotham, "will have presents for me." "You do wrong to take his presents," said Jotham. "He is a treacherous man, and your father is a fool to trust him." Ethbaal laughed. A small boy was walking along the decks, accompanied by a manservant. He was dressed in a rich tunic of many colors and had sandals of the softest leather on his feet. The servant rebuked him for kicking pebbles with them. The people who saw him stopped and stared, and many kissed the sacred amulets that hung about their necks and made reverences. Ethbaal and Jotham stopped too, and when the child saw them, he ran to them. Ethbaal dropped to her knees beside him, kissing his hands and stroking his curly hair. He was a pretty child, but pale and cross-looking, spoiled by all the homage he was receiving. "Who is she?" I said, when he had gone by, thinking him perhaps the son of the ruler of the city. "He is a cousin of mine," said Ethbaal. "Jabin is his name. He is the firstborn child of a kinsman of my father." To my surprise, I saw that she had turned pale. Jotham had not bowed or spoken, but had stared at the child with eyes that seemed to burn with some strange feeling. "Look away from him," he said. "He is already dead." I turned to him curiously. A firstborn child, Ethbaal had said. Ethbaal too had spoken of his firstborn son, and that he had died, but he had not said how. I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could speak, a man nearby, carrying timber for a ship's hull, stumbled and fell, damaging the material that he carried. A spear carrying foreman hurried over to him, struck him with the butt end of the spear, and raised it for another blow. Suddenly something happened in my mind, and I was no longer on the waterfront at Tyre. I was back in Arzawa, and the captain of the sea people was beating my father to death. The captain of the sea people was beating my father to death. Without a sound, I sprang upon the foreman, wrenched the spear away from him, and struck him with it across the side of the head. I heard the people around me cry out. I felt a bleak joy, and struck the foreman again across the jaw, knocking him down on the stones. I might have killed him if another man had not come upon the scene at that moment, seized me, and swung me aside in one powerful motion. And when I saw him, I nearly did go mad, for he had blue eyes and curling bronze hair, so that when I looked into his face, I thought I was looking at that same blue-eyed man who had killed my father. I sprang at him too, but this time I was driven off in earnest. A big, powerful dog leapt upon my shoulders, snarling fiercely and bearing me down upon the pavement. "Back, Pelops!" shouted the man, and the dog let go, still growling softly. The foreman, in the meantime, had recovered himself and was hurrying off, shouting that his master would bring charges against the family of Ethbaal. I gathered myself together and got to my feet, staring at the stranger. He was, of course, not the man who had killed my father. He did not even look like him, for, though tall and strong, he was slender and graceful and elegant of manner. It was only his eyes and hair and height that had reminded me of the Achaeans at home. He spoke to Jotham as if he knew him. "Have you all gone mad?" he asked. "Why did you stop him?" asked Jotham bitterly. I stared at him in amazement and realized that his joy in the beating of the foreman had been the same as my own. The stranger laughed suddenly and gave Jotham a scornful salaam. "My apologies, young master," he said. "I forgot that the punishment of a servant might offend you. It is hard to remember that a lord of Tyre is a kinsman of slaves." Jotham turned pale, but Ethbaal spoke hastily. "Jotham is right," she said surprisingly. "These men who wear out their labor in that way deserve to be beaten. Some of them even put children to work in the furnaces and mines and lose them before they are grown. Is it any wonder that they ruin themselves buying new workers? I have heard stories of you too, Achiel, and how you drive your oarsmen. Achiel, it seemed, was the master of her father's ship. I guessed from his looks and his manner of speech that he was some kind of foreigner. He was looking at me now, and it was with the look of the sea people in Arzawa. "Who is this one?" he said. "Fair-skinned for a Canaanite, isn't he? And such a fine nose. I can guess where he's from. There are many young ruffians of his kind nowadays, hiding about in safe corners of the world." He laughed and turned away. I stared toward him, forgetting the dog Pelops, but I felt a restraining hand on my shoulder and saw that it was Jotham's. We looked at each other curiously, and I knew that from now on we would probably be friends. So now we come to the first choice. We need to read 4 days of 3 chapters and 8 days of 2 chapters in order to finish this book in the same time with Ecclesiastes. So do we read a 3rd chapter today?
Yes!
Or do we read a 3rd chapter tomorrow?
The show must go on.
JJ says the show must go on. So let me continue. Chapter 5, The Temple of Moloch. Ethbaal had come to meet us, not knowing what had been going on. He and Jotham were to board his father's ship to check the cargo and the accounts, and he sent me on ahead with Achiel to be shown whatever interested me. I walked beside the ship, master in sullen silence. He did not speak to me either, but swung along, humming sea songs beneath his breath. Several times he slashed viciously with his staff at slaves and commoners who got in his way. I thought he did this out of cruelty rather than anger, for he seemed in a good enough humor. The black ship was larger close to than it had seemed at a distance. Walking up the gangplank, I set foot for the first time on the deck of a ship, and did not like it, thinking of the green water rolling beneath its hull. Achiel's cabin had fine hangings of goatskin, fine rugs and furnishings, and above all, ornaments and objects of art, so perfectly and beautifully carved and molded and painted that I could hardly believe it. Before I could ask him where they came from, voices were heard outside the cabin. Come in, my young lords!" Achiel cried as Ethbaal and Jotham followed us. "I have figures here and totals and the rattle of silver that will gladden your hearts. But first," and he bowed low to Ethbaal, "there are presents in my box for the lady Mehetabel. Poor things, but they may give her pleasure. Let her come aboard when she wishes and take her pick." Ethbaal nodded graciously, but Jotham reddened with anger. Achiel saw it and smiled. The business of the day began. Ethbaal and Jotham sat before a table, checking Achiel's cargo list and weighing out the silver shekels he had received on his voyage. I watched the proceedings of these merchants with scorn at first, then, to my shame, became interested. I would have liked to understand the marks on the tablets and papyrus. The rest of the day we spent on the flat deck, watching and checking cargo that was taken from the ship, metals from the northern lands of Achaia, papyrus from the town of Byblos, other merchandise that Ethbaal would sell as a profit, and, of course, slaves. Some of these slaves were men who might have been of the people of Achiel, but he showed no interest in any of them except one. This was a well-dressed, assured young man to whom he spoke in a low voice before telling Ethbaal that he had bought him on his own, and that he was destined as a present for the chief of Tyre. I thought that Ethbaal, for some reason, seemed disturbed at that, but he made no protest. Ethbaal went home for the evening meal, but Jotham and I stayed late, and food was cooked for us in the ship's galley. We ate on the deck, and toward the end of the meal I saw gangs of men in chains being led up from below and walked about at the other end of the ship. Never had I seen men so pale and gray of skin, though some looked as though they might have been dark men naturally. The smell of them reached us, and some of them, I could see, were so thin and weak that it was hard for them to stumble across the deck. "Who are they?" I asked one of the sailors. "The oarsmen," said the sailor. "Our captain doesn't believe in wasting much food on them when they won't live long anyway." Jotham and I walked home together that night with a warehouse slave carrying a torch to light our way. We were silent at first, for I was thinking of all that I had seen that day, the wonder of the sea, the splendor of the shipmaster's cabin, the rich goods in the warehouse of Ethbaal, and also of the pallor and hopelessness of the faces of the children in the weaving rooms and the workmen by the copper furnaces, of what Hannibal had told me of the dye houses and the brutality of Achill. Finally Jotham spoke. "Do you still think Tyre is a fine town?" he asked. "I don't know," I replied. Suddenly he stopped still in the street. "This is the heart of Tyre," he said. "Have you seen it?" I looked about me and saw with that strange cold feeling I had felt before that we were in the open space in front of the temple of Moloch. "Come on," said Jotham, and the torchlight made his eyes glitter. "Come inside." I followed him into the courtyard with its trees sacred to Adonai, its pillar in honor of the serpent Shon, and its image of the holy Astarte. There was an unpleasant odor about the place, as there is about altars where animals are sacrificed. It was dark, but Jotham told the trembling servant to raise his torch, and the blaze suddenly outlined the figure of a great black image squatting within, its arms outstretched. I started and made the ancient sign against evil. Never had I seen so ugly a god. "This is Moloch," said Jotham, "the lord of wrath, he who devours the firstborn children of Canaan." And all at once I understood. "The oldest son of Ethbaal," I said, "the little boy Jabin, they are chosen from the greatest families of the cities," said Jotham, staring at the image, "and dedicated to Moloch in case a time of trouble should come upon the city. A fire is kindled in the lap of the god, and the child is laid in his arms to die. All the city comes to see." I began to shiver, staring at the black, outstretched arms, but I said nothing, for we Hittites had been taught to worship all the gods. After a moment, Jotham shrugged and led me out of the place. We walked home in silence. That night I could not sleep. I decided I never would till I had driven the image of Moloch from my mind, and for a start I asked Jotham some questions. "Where does Achill come from?" I asked him. "From the west. He is one of the sea people," said Jotham, and after a moment he added, "He is a spy. Did you see that slave he brought here for the chief of the city?" "What about him?" "He is no slave, but he will be in the household of the chief, and all that he learns there he will tell to Achill." I thought of the ox carts and the chariots of the sea people at home, and felt the old fear. "Why," I asked, "should they send spies into Canaan?" Then Jotham began to tell me about the sea people, and I listened eagerly, for I realized that, though they had destroyed my world and almost my life, I knew nothing about them. "They are the children of Zeus the Thunderer," he said, "from the islands to the western mainland, and up into the forests of the north, even beyond the river Danube. Some of them, like the ancestors of Achill, came down many years ago and married with the ancient peoples and became subjects of the old Minos of Crete." "Minos?" I said. Here at least was something I had heard of. "The great kings who lived in the labyrinth, the house of the double axe of Gnosis, who bred the great bulls for the bull dances, but they were friends of our people." "Yes," said Jotham. "All they wanted was our trade. But the earthquakes came, and their great city of Gnosis was ruined, and the Minos was overthrown by his subjects on the mainland, the men with the northern blood in their veins. Now their great men are the sons and kinsmen of the Achaean Atreus, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and the rest. They live in the old places and cling to what is left of the old arts and comforts. But new people are coming down into their land from the far north, more than ever before. They say they need more room. So they are leaving their homes and coming into the east. They have come to Great Hatti. Next it will be Egypt by way of Canaan. That is why they are sending spies into Tyre. But why do the Canaanites not stop them? Jotham shrugged. The Canaanites are only slaves of Egypt. Why should they care if they change masters, if they can keep their riches and go on burning their children in the fire of Moloch? I lay for a while, turning all these new things over in my mind, then sat up on my elbow and stared at Jotham with curiosity and envy. How do you know all these things? I asked him. I listen to the traders and the sailors, said Jotham, and I read what I can. It passes the time. I was silent for a while. Then suddenly, to my own surprise, I heard myself asking, what are those 22 signs that Hannibal spoke of? The Aleph-Beth signs? Aleph-Beth, yeah. The Aleph-Beth signs? Jotham sat up, too, and looked at me. Do you want to learn? And so, till far into the night, we sat over a papyrus and did not sleep till I had memorized the 22 signs from which all the words of all the tongues of the nations might be formed, and I knew that in one night I had made myself master of what scholars before me, scholars of the ancient picture writing, had spent all their youth in learning. But before I slept, I asked Jotham one more question. To which of the sea peoples does Akil belong? To a people from the island of Crete, Kaftor as we call it, he said. The Egyptians call them Pelest. We call them Philistines. And that is the end of chapter 5, and we'll have to continue on with chapter 6 next time. I hope that you're enjoying the story, Hittite Warrior by Joanne Williamson, and we will continue next time. God bless you. Have a great night.